From the moment he and Jane Fonda stepped onto the screen together in Barefoot in the Park in 1967, audiences saw something different. It wasn't just two actors playing newlyweds, it was laughter that came too easily, glances that lingered too long, and chemistry so real it left viewers wondering what was happening when the cameras stopped. Over the years, they reunited on screen, again and again in ways that looked less like acting and more like two lives circling each other, always just out of reach. And now, Redford's revelation has confirmed what so many hoped was true. Jane Fonda, through decades of missed chances and parallel lives, was the love of his life. But why did he keep it hidden until now? And what does this confession reveal about one of Hollywood's most enduring and most unspoken love stories? In the mid-1960s, Robert Redford and Jane Fonda were still climbing the uncertain ladder of Hollywood. Neither yet carried the weight of legend, though the potential was obvious. Redford, with his quiet intensity, was being called the next great leading man. Fonda, fiercely ambitious and unafraid of risk, had already begun carving out her own reputation as an actress who could balance glamour with grit. When Paramount cast them together in Barefoot in the Park, no one could have predicted what would happen once the cameras rolled. The film told the story of newlyweds navigating a cramped New York apartment, but what audiences saw was something more, a kind of spark that felt dangerously close to real. Redford's restrained warmth collided with Fonda's vivacious energy, and the result was electric. Theater critics noticed it immediately. Reviewers wrote that they seemed to be discovering each other rather than performing for an audience. For the actors, that perception wasn't entirely wrong. Behind the scenes, Redford and Fonda found themselves laughing between takes, lingering in conversation when the workday ended, building a rhythm that extended beyond the script. The crew whispered about it, sensing a bond that couldn't be manufactured. Yet neither Redford nor Fonda crossed the invisible line. Both were married. Redford to his college sweetheart Lola Van Wagenen, Fonda to French director Roger Vadim, and both were determined to keep their professional reputations intact. Still, even with those barriers, the connection was undeniable. What makes Barefoot in the Park so unforgettable isn't just its light-hearted comedy. It's the way the camera seemed to catch moments that didn't belong to the story at all. A smile held a second too long. A look that carried weight no dialogue could explain. Fans left theaters certain they had glimpsed something real, and they weren't wrong. For Redford, who often shied away from public displays of emotion, the experience was disarming. He admitted years later that working with Fonda felt unusually effortless, as if the roles were written for them rather than assigned. Fonda described a similar sensation, saying that Redford's stillness gave her freedom to play, to stretch, to shine. Together they created a kind of cinematic balance, her fire meeting his calm, that neither would replicate with anyone else. The irony is that while audiences assumed romance, what grew between them was something subtler: trust. In an industry notorious for competition and betrayal, they found a partnership that carried no threat, only encouragement. It would set the tone for every collaboration that followed, shaping not only their careers but also the way they viewed each other in private life. Yet even at that first peak, there was a lingering question: if the chemistry was so powerful, why didn't it ever cross into real life? The answer, as the years unfolded, would prove more complicated than anyone expected. As the 1970s dawned, both Robert Redford and Jane Fonda began living lives that looked dazzling from the outside, but were tangled with complexity beneath. Their careers were ascending in parallel, each marked by box office triumphs and critical acclaim. Redford became the quintessential American star with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting, while Fonda redefined what a leading actress could be with Clute and Coming Home. Yet for all the applause and accolades, their personal paths rarely aligned. Redford settled into his marriage with Lola Van Wagenen, raising a family away from the spotlight. He was drawn to the idea of stability, a private world beyond the reach of cameras, even as the pressures of fame grew heavier. Fonda, by contrast, was constantly in motion. Her marriage to Roger Vadim ended in 1973, followed by a stormy union with activist Tom Hayden. Her life became a fusion of art and politics, as she marched against wars, challenged Washington, and balanced motherhood with her career. What's striking in this period is how often Redford and Fonda's names resurfaced together in the industry. Offers for joint projects circulated. Studios knew their chemistry could turn an ordinary script into a hit, but timing was rarely on their side. One of them would be committed elsewhere, or personal circumstances made it impossible. It was as if Hollywood itself kept trying to reunite them, only for life to intervene. Still, their connection never dissolved. They attended the same events, crossed paths at awards ceremonies, exchanged brief, meaningful conversations in crowded rooms. Those who observed them privately recalled a kind of familiarity that hadn't faded since Barefoot in the Park. A glance, a shared laugh, a quiet warmth, always just enough to stir speculation, never enough to confirm it. Through these years, Fonda's life was marked by reinvention. She transformed from a Hollywood ingenue into a powerful symbol of female resilience, enduring public criticism for her activism while refusing to retreat. Redford, meanwhile, retreated deeper into his private world, channeling his energy into directing and laying the foundation for what would become the Sundance Institute. Outwardly, they appeared to be moving in opposite directions, she toward confrontation, he toward quiet creation. Yet beneath that contrast lay an unspoken tether. The missed chances between them weren't just about timing. They were about the roles each had chosen to play in their personal lives. Redford valued loyalty to his family, even when his marriage strained under the weight of his career. Fonda threw herself into relationships with men who matched her fiery intensity, but often left her vulnerable. Each found something they needed elsewhere, yet each also carried a subtle awareness that the other represented something different, something lasting. When the 1980s arrived, both were established icons. Redford won an Academy Award for directing Ordinary People, while Fonda took home her second Oscar. They were no longer rising stars, they were institutions, and yet in the midst of these triumphs, questions lingered. Audiences still remembered their luminous pairing in the 60s. Why hadn't they reunited? Why hadn't their lives intertwined more deeply? Decades later, the truth would surface. The bond never broke, it simply waited. The missed chances of the 70s and 80s weren't endings at all, but pauses in a story that refused to fade. By the 1990s, Robert Redford and Jane Fonda had become more than movie stars. They were cultural figures. Each had crafted a legacy that extended far beyond the screen, and yet their personal journeys were moving along separate tracks. Redford, ever protective of his private life, shifted his focus increasingly toward directing and nurturing independent voices through the Sundance Institute. He seemed determined to build something lasting, something bigger than himself, while avoiding the gossip and spectacle that came with celebrity. Fonda, meanwhile, entered a period of transformation that startled even her closest observers. After decades of activism and high-profile roles, she stepped back from Hollywood in the early 1990s. For more than a decade, she disappeared from the screen, devoting herself to family, philanthropy, and eventually to a spiritual and personal awakening that followed the end of her marriage to Ted Turner. For audiences who had grown up with her, the silence was striking. For Redford, it was simply another reminder that their lives, however closely they had once run, were now moving at different speeds. And yet, despite the distance, they never lost sight of each other. Industry insiders often remarked that whenever Fonda resurfaced, at charity events, political gatherings, or film festivals, Redford was never far behind in conversation. He spoke of her with a respect and warmth reserved for very few, describing her not in terms of controversy or glamour, but as someone who carried an unshakable authenticity. She, in turn, often credited him with embodying a kind of integrity rare in Hollywood, a steadiness she admired from afar. The absence of public collaboration during this period only seemed to magnify the private bond. Unlike their peers, who capitalized on nostalgia with reunion projects, Redford and Fonda remained apart on screen, and that choice only deepened the mystery. Why not reunite? Why not give audiences what they craved? The answer, whispered by those who knew them, was that their connection had never required performance to survive. It was there, unspoken, unexploited, waiting for its own time. This era also brought personal reckonings. Redford endured the end of his nearly three-decade marriage, while Fonda faced the unraveling of her relationship with Turner. Both weathered health scares, family challenges, and the inevitable changes that come with aging. Through it all, the public saw resilience. But beneath the surface, both leaned quietly on the constants in their lives. And for each of them, the other was one of those constants, even from a distance. What made their bond endure across decades of separation was not romance in the conventional sense, but trust. Hollywood is a place where relationships are tested by ego, betrayal, and ambition. Redford and Fonda somehow managed to avoid all three. They did not speak ill of each other, did not exploit their history, did not allow rumors to distort the truth. Instead, they preserved a rare kind of friendship, one that felt like a secret even when the world was watching. For audiences, the absence of their pairing during these years became its own story. Each time Redford appeared with a new co-star, or Fonda returned to the spotlight in a rare role, the same question surfaced: why not together? The silence was deafening, and it only heightened anticipation for what might one day happen if the two finally reunited. That anticipation would eventually find its answer, not in youth or middle age, but in the twilight of their careers, when both finally stepped back into the same frame, allowing decades of unspoken truth to surface. When Robert Redford and Jane Fonda finally reunited on screen in Our Souls at Night in 2017, it felt less like a casting decision and more like fate catching up with them. By then, Redford was in his early 80s, Fonda in her late 70s. Both had weathered the storms of life, both had carved their names into Hollywood history, and yet there was unfinished business between them. The film, adapted from Kent Haruf's quiet novel, told the story of two widowed neighbors who find unexpected comfort and love late in life. For audiences, it was more than a story. It was the reunion they had been waiting decades to see. What unfolded on screen was intimate in a way that surprised even seasoned critics. Redford's character carried a weary tenderness, while Fonda's radiated vulnerability wrapped in strength. Every touch, every glance carried the weight of history. Viewers weren't just watching two fictional neighbors fall in love. They were watching decades of personal connection finally surface. The performances felt stripped of artifice, as though the pair weren't acting at all, but rather letting the truth of their bond bleed through the dialogue. Behind the scenes, both admitted the experience was unlike anything they had done before. Redford, known for his reserve, described the film as a gift, a chance to explore something real with someone he trusted implicitly. Fonda, in her typically candid way, said she felt safe with him, that she could let down her guard in ways few others allowed. What made those admissions remarkable was not just their honesty but their timing. After 6 decades of friendship, these two titans of cinema were acknowledging what had long been unspoken. For Redford especially, the project carried deeper significance. He had announced it would be his final role as a leading man, his farewell to the type of characters that had defined him. Choosing Fonda as his last on-screen partner was not incidental. It was deliberate, almost symbolic. Of all the actresses he could have shared that moment with, he chose the one whose presence had shadowed his career from the beginning. It was a decision that spoke louder than any interview. Audiences felt it too. Reviews praised their natural ease, noting that their chemistry seemed untouched by time. Some critics even confessed that the film's quiet power lay less in its script than in the history the actors brought with them. To see them together again was to witness something rare in Hollywood: continuity. A bond that had survived youth, fame, politics, marriages, divorces, and decades of absence, only to resurface more authentic than ever. It was in this context, promoting the film, that Redford finally let slip the words that fans had long suspected. He spoke not in declarations, but in acknowledgments, admitting that Jane Fonda had always held a special place in his life, one unlike anyone else. For a man as guarded as Redford, the admission was seismic. It was not performance, not marketing, but truth, the kind of truth that only emerges when time has stripped away everything else. The impact was immediate. Headlines captured the revelation. Fans revisited their earlier films with fresh eyes, and suddenly the story of Redford and Fonda was no longer about speculation. It was about confirmation. She had been, quietly, the love that defined him. But why wait until then? Why not speak earlier, when youth and opportunity might have allowed more? The answer lies in Redford's own nature. A lifetime of restraint, a refusal to expose his heart until the very end. For most of his career, Robert Redford was known as much for what he didn't say as for what he revealed. Silence was his shield. In an industry built on confessions, scandals, and endless self-promotion, he learned early that privacy was power. That instinct shaped the way he handled everything, from his family to his politics to his friendships. It explains why, even as audiences sensed his closeness to Jane Fonda, he never confirmed what so many suspected. To understand his reluctance, it helps to remember how carefully he guarded the few personal details that did escape. When his first marriage ended after nearly 3 decades, he never gave interviews dissecting the breakup. When his children faced hardships, he drew a curtain around their lives. Even his philanthropic work through Sundance, though deeply meaningful to him, was framed as service, not self-expression. In that context, admitting Jane Fonda's place in his heart would have felt like crossing a line he had drawn for himself long ago. Timing mattered too. During their most active years, both were tied to other people. Speaking openly about his feelings could have caused pain or misunderstanding. Redford's loyalty, sometimes to a fault, prevented him from disrupting the lives they had chosen apart. Fonda, with her own series of complex relationships, was rarely in a position where such a revelation would have been welcome. To acknowledge her publicly as the love of his life might have risked more than it offered. There was also the matter of identity. Redford was never comfortable with the role of romantic idol, despite the way Hollywood cast him. He resisted the heartthrob label, resisted gossip, resisted anything that made him feel reduced to image rather than substance. To declare lifelong love for a co-star might have looked, in his eyes, like feeding the very machine he had spent his career resisting. For decades, silence seemed the more honorable choice. And yet, time alters perspective. By the time Our Souls at Night reached audiences, Redford was nearing the end of his acting career. The urgency of youth was gone, replaced by the awareness that some truths, if not spoken now, might never be spoken at all. Fonda, too, had embraced late-life candor, unafraid to reflect publicly on her triumphs and regrets. Together they created a space where honesty no longer carried the same risks it once had. What made his admission so powerful was not just the content, but the context. At 82, Redford had nothing left to prove. His career was secure, his legacy cemented, his family grown. In that light, acknowledging Jane Fonda was not about fueling speculation, but about honoring a truth that had quietly shaped his life. It was a final act of clarity from a man who had built his world on restraint. For audiences, the revelation landed with unexpected force. It reframed decades of cinema, casting new light on performances once thought of as fictional. It also offered a rare glimpse into the heart of a man who had spent a lifetime keeping it hidden. More than anything, it reminded fans that even legends carry untold stories, and sometimes the greatest love is the one lived in silence until the very end. And so, Redford's confession was not simply a revelation about Jane Fonda. It was a window into the hidden life of a man who had always chosen privacy, until he finally chose truth. Robert Redford's late-life admission about Jane Fonda did not come with fanfare, nor did it arrive as a carefully staged headline. It came quietly, as so much of his truth always has. For a man who spent a lifetime keeping the deepest parts of himself hidden, choosing to name her at all was extraordinary. It was a gesture not of regret, but of recognition, a way of honoring a bond that outlasted careers, marriages, and decades of silence. What makes their story resonate so deeply is not that it ended in romance, but that it didn't need to. In an era where Hollywood love affairs often burned bright and collapsed quickly, Redford and Fonda created something different. Their connection was steady, enduring, built not on fleeting passion, but on trust and mutual respect. For 60 years, it lingered beneath the surface, shaping their choices, coloring their work, and giving audiences a glimpse of something real every time they appeared together. By finally speaking the words, Redford gave voice to what so many fans had always believed. He confirmed that the glances, the laughter, the ease that marked their collaborations were not illusions. They were evidence of a bond that defied definition. For Fonda, the acknowledgement was a gift. For Redford, it was a release. And for audiences, it was a revelation that turned decades of speculation into a truth both tender and bittersweet. In the end, their story reminds us that love takes many forms. Sometimes it is lived openly, sometimes it is hidden, and sometimes it is carried quietly across an entire lifetime, never needing to be named until the very end. Robert Redford's words ensure that this chapter will not fade into rumor or nostalgia. It will endure, just as their connection endured, a reminder that even the most private lives hold truths worth sharing. For more emotional stories, check out this video.